student, she decided to also become a tutor in chemistry, and was selected to be the outstanding student in biology and chemistry at Santa Barbara City College. She transferred in 2019 to UCLA and graduated summa cum laude with a degree in molecular cell and developmental biology and a minor in society and genetics. She took the MCAT recently and scored in the 99th percentile, and she is working as a Mohs surgery histotechnician, and she is applying in the 2022-23 application cycle.
Thank you so much, Jubin. I'm going to try to share my screen for the slide, my PowerPoint. Okay, is everyone able to see this? Cool. Okay. Okay, so I've put together a short little PowerPoint just about how to study for the MCAT and some of the techniques that I found really helpful. So just as Jubin mentioned, I went to Santa Barbara City College and I transferred in fall of 2019 to UCLA, where I studied cell and developmental biology and minored in society and genetics. I self-studied for the MCAT. So I actually ended up graduating UCLA a little bit early, and I graduated in the end of winter quarter, which finished in March. And then I spent April to July studying for the MCAT. So I didn't really study full-time in April. I was working at a COVID-19 clinic or vaccination clinic. But then starting in May through July, I was studying full-time. So I wasn't working at this time and I wasn't taking any classes. So I did want to preface with that. I'm going to talk a little bit about some techniques if you do have to work or if you are taking classes for studying for the MCAT, but I personally was very fortunate that I didn't have any other commitments during that time. I took the MCAT on August 8th, and then I got my scores back about a month later. One little point of clarification, I actually got in the 98th percentile, not 99th. They updated the percentile rankings. And then also I'm applying to medical school this cycle. So I've already started my application. It opened in May. I was able to start putting in information for it. And then hopefully I will be submitting at the very beginning of June and should hear back by the end of this year. So first I wanted to talk a little bit about the timeline, because I think this is something that can be really confusing for people. The actual timeline of medical admission. So the exam, MCAT exam dates start in January. There's a few random January dates, and then there's some in March, but then it really starts picking up in late spring to throughout the summer. So there's exam dates probably a few every week during the summer. So scores will be released one month after that you take your exam. So you have to wait a month to get your scores back. And then because of that, people like to try to take the MCAT no later than May of their application cycle. So if you take your exam in May, you get your scores back sometime in June, and then you're able to apply to schools knowing where you lie, which is for people that take it at a later date, that can be a little bit tricky. If you're applying to schools in June and you don't know what your exam is, or you can even apply to schools later in the summer if you take the exam in, say, September or August, September. You can apply to schools without an MCAT exam for some schools and then get it in the future, but that's just kind of risky and it's expensive too. So the whole application process can be really expensive, and it's best for you to know exactly where you're standing and what schools you'll be a competitive applicant for before you apply. So I think because of all of this, I do think a good time to take the exam is in the summer before you apply. So if you're planning on transferring and then applying to medical school and starting medical school straight out of once you graduate your transfer university, that would be taking it the summer before you transfer. So you would take the exam that summer and then apply to medical school in June of the next year. June of your the summer going into your senior year. And then after senior year, you would be matriculating into medical school that fall. So I say it's ideal to take it in the summer just because I think it's easier for pre-meds have a lot of classes and you're studying for a lot of your other classes. And with the MCAT, especially if you're balancing work and school, it's best to do it in summer where you're able to have a little bit more free time and maybe you're not focusing so much on other classes. So I'm going to go into that a little bit more with the studying timeline. So I've seen a lot of places online say to try to study for at least 300 hours of studying. I personally did more than that. I'm going to say I was probably closer to 400, 450 hours because I was studying full time for 3 months. So with this, you're really going to want to adjust it for what works for you. If you're working full time during the week, studying 40 hours a week is not really feasible. You can't do that, study full time and work full time. It's tricky. So you might have to take a little bit more time and instead of studying for just 3 months, try to study for 6 months at a lower, just a few less hours per week. And it also depends on how recently you took the classes. So if you just took chemistry, just took physics, and just took a bunch of biochem classes, you're going to be pretty solid in those sections of the exam. You're going to not need to do as much content review because it's still fresh in your mind. For someone like me, where I took physics at the community college, and I also took it over the summer, as well as my chemistry class. So it was really really quick. I learned a lot in a short period of time and I didn't retain it as much as I needed to. So I did have to spend a lot of time on content review when I was studying for the MCAT. So content review, again, that's going to really, the amount of time that you want to dedicate to that will vary for people. I personally spent about a month and a half just purely doing content review. You can see I have my I posted a picture of that. I have my schedule where every day I would do 2 sections from one of the Kaplan books, which looking back on it, I do think wasn't the best use of my time. I ended up doing content review on things that I'd already learned or still felt pretty solid about. So I think it's better to kind of identify some weak spots that you have and then go from there when you're doing content review. And then I found this study from Johns Hopkins where they were talking about, they were quizzing people that scored above the 90th percentile in the MCAT about how many months they need to study and how many hours per day. So a lot of people, it looks like almost 2/3 or over 2/3 think you really only need to study 1 to 3 months. And I would agree with that if you're studying full time. If you're studying part-time and have a lot of other commitments, then you're probably going to need a little bit more time than that. But ideally 1 to 3 months, usually over the summer, and then studying pretty intensely. It's 48.9, almost half of them said that they studied for more than 4 hours a day. Okay, I'm going to go into some of the resources that I found helpful next. So third-party resources, I put in some of the prices. With a lot of these, you'll be able to find, you can apply for, if you have a financial need, a lot of times you're able to get some of these resources for cheaper. But I just put up the prices for what's listed on Amazon. So personally, I did the Kaplan 7-book set, and then I also bought with that 3 online practice exams. I liked the book set because it really, I felt like it explained a lot of I felt like it explained things pretty well, but it was a lot of information. I'm not sure how much it was necessary because later in my studying, I actually found Khan Academy and I was looking at the Khan Academy MCAT prep stuff and they had everything that the Kaplan book has, but for free. So that's something you could look into, or you could look into Khan Academy. The Princeton Review is another one that's really popular. I personally did not use it, but they have a 1-book set where it's just one really big book and then 4 practice exams for $90. I did use Blueprint online exams. So they do exam bundles and you can get 4 exams for $150, up to 10 exams for $400. So that's something I found it helpful just to have more practice problems available, but I know sometimes people split that with friends too. So you can retake those exams on Blueprint multiple times. So sometimes people would just get a group of friends together that were all studying for the MCAT and pay for it and just share the account. So that's an option. Uworld is another. I heard a lot about Uworld. I personally did not use it. So Uworld is practice passages and practice questions. It's $250 to have unlimited access or to have basic access to it. And I've heard it's really, really helpful and pretty similar to the actual exam, but I just, this started getting really expensive really fast. So I spent my money on the Kaplan exam, and then I got the Blueprint exam bundle. And I didn't really feel like I needed things other than that. And then additionally, there's also Jack Weston, which is a really helpful website. They have CARS passages for free. So you're able to get critical analysis and reasoning skills passages. There's a new one every day that's free. They have other passages, but I think they really excel in CARS prep. And I'm going to go into I'll go into each section a little bit more. And then next, the most helpful thing is the AAMC resources. So these are the official, they're made by the people that make the MCAT, that write the MCAT. So it's the gold standard because this is going to be the closest to the actual exam that you'll get. I feel like it's necessary. I really do think that if you're going to get just one resource, get the AAMC online bundle that has the diagnostic exam. So you can take that at the beginning before you start studying just to kind of see where you're at. And then it also has 4 full-length practice exams. It also has section bank questions, so a lot of practice problems, and then it has a question bank. The section bank questions are really, really difficult. I found maybe I had 1 or 2 sections on the MCAT that were that level of difficulty, but for the most part, don't be discouraged if you don't do very well in the section bank, because I definitely did not. It's pretty hard. And then the question bank questions are a little bit more straightforward questions, but it's still good for you to kind of hammer in some of those concepts. And then now I'm going to go into each of the sections. So I have these in the order of the actual exam. So when you first start the MCAT, your very first section is Chemical and Physical Foundations of Biological Systems, or Chem Phys. This was the section that I personally struggled the most with. Like I said, I took chemistry and physics at community college over the summer, and I wanted to get it done with. I got an A in the classes. I was happy. I moved on, but I didn't retain the information that much, and it didn't really come up in my future upper division classes. So I had to spend a lot of time on chem physics. What I found helpful was to use flashcards to memorize formulas and units. So I actually I normally use online flashcards, but for this I use paper flashcards, and I would have, I'd write the equation for energy on the front, and then I'd have to write down the actual equation, because on the MCAT you will be expected to memorize some of these formulas. Nothing super difficult, and the numbers will always be really nice because you're not allowed to have a calculator on the exam. So you do have to, divide and multiply things in your head. So the numbers are usually pretty easy. It's like 2 times, 2 and 1, but it gets tricky where you have to remember, oh, am I supposed to divide here? Am I supposed to multiply here? And for that, you're going to need the equations. So if you look up online, physics cheat sheets for the MCAT, it'll give you a list of the formulas that you'll need. And then I really recommend just memorizing those. And it's a pain, but in the end, it'll be worth it, and you'll be really happy that you did. Another thing is to memorize the units. I know there were a few, during my practice exams, sometimes I wouldn't remember the specific formula that I needed, but if I could remember the units, I was able to find it, just because the units would be off on some of the answers. So it's like, oh, well, I know that a joule is supposed to be, I can't remember what it is now, but at the time I knew, and just memorizing the units will really help you, because sometimes you'll be able to find the answer that way. For chem and physics, doing lots of practice problems is helpful, because you'll just know when you're supposed to use what formula. And I think just kind of with these sorts of questions, there's some conceptual understanding that you need, but a lot of it's just knowing when to apply what formula. I personally really like the Med School Coach MCAT Basics podcast. I would go on walks and listen to it, and I felt like they did a really good job explaining the chem or the physics parts of things in ways that I could understand. When I was just reading it out of a textbook, it didn't click in my head personally. So hearing somebody explain it in different words and kind of drawing analogies to different things that I could see and could understand made it easier for me. But if you like chem and physics, you might not need to do that. And then another thing, a really big thing, I think, is the unit conversion. So this shows up a lot on the MCAT. they'll give you a question where everything's in centimeters and you're thinking of things in centimeters, but then all of the answers will be, it'll be the same number. It'll be 200 micrometers, 200 centimeters, 200 kilometers or kilometers. It'll just have different units, and you have to be able to be like, okay, well, 200 centimeters is equal to 0.2 kilometers or 0.0. It's definitely not that, but you have to be able to jump in between those units. So that's something to practice with. It's just a little thing that shows up a lot on the MCAT and is pretty simple to learn. And I think it'll help in the long run. So now I'm going to move into critical analysis and reasoning skills. This is CARS. And this is one of those ones where it's pretty interesting. You can see people with 511s and they got super high scores in the chem, in the biology and the sociology, psychology, but then their CARS just pulled them down. Or it could be the opposite. Somebody did really well in CARS, but not well on the other sections and got the same score. And it's just a difficult one to study for because, especially if English isn't your first language, it can be really challenging to study for CARS. And there's a lot of different techniques that I've seen online. CARS will be so many different possible topics. There's no way for you to learn about it. You just have to get familiar and comfortable with reading the passages. So I do think it's important to take a diagnostic test at the beginning and see where your CARS is at. I didn't have to study too much for CARS. I've always really liked reading, but if you're struggling with it, I know Jack Weston is one of the best resources for improving your CARS. I think you just need to keep practicing it, doing 1 or 2 a day and finding a technique that works for you. I will say, try to enjoy it a little bit. I know it can be tricky. And for a lot of people, CARS it's very challenging and doesn't seem super useful. It's important as a physician for you to be able to understand and kind of interpret literature in a way. So that's why they test on it. But it can be frustrating when you're reading a passage about dance styles from the 1920s and, this is going to be part of your MCAT score. So I think just approaching the passages with a good attitude and being like, okay, this is my opportunity to learn something new and learn about something that you never heard of before and just go with it. So it's always good to kind of go into things with a good attitude rather than, maybe having resentment that you have to do it. So for CARS, research, and I like this little Jack Weston CARS practice thing. They have a lot of resources and can help you improve your score if you're really struggling with CARS. Moving into the Bio and Biochem Foundations. So this is B&B, Bio and Biochem. I recommend for people to take this after they've taken Biochem at their transfer school. So I know it's possible to take the MCAT after, if you've completed all of your requirements for California schools, for UCs or CSUs to transfer into a biology program. You will have taken chem, you will have taken physics, organic chemistry, biology, all of the things that you technically need to take the MCAT. But I still, because of the bio and biochem section, I really do recommend waiting until you've taken biochem at your transfer university. Because, in biochem, you really delve deeply into glycolysis, Krebs cycle, which you might have been exposed to already from your biology classes at your community college. But there's a different depth that you take when you are in biochem. That's really helpful. And there's other formulas. I'm not sure if, I know my community college never really went into enzyme kinetics and Michaelis-Menten equations, but those come back and they're a big part of the MCAT. So I do think it's really helpful to take biochem before you take the MCAT. So this section is kind of a mix of memorization and data interpretation. I showed 2 examples. So on the first one, up at the top, you can see they're explaining an experimental design question, and then you'll usually have one passage talking about an experiment and an approach that they're taking. And then after that, there'll be about 5 to 7 questions specifically about interpreting that data, interpreting the graph, maybe what would happen if you knock down this, or if the experimenters wanted to investigate something else, what could they do? So with those sorts of questions, it's really important that you have some familiarity with scientific journals. So another reason why I do think it's good to take the MCAT after you've done about a year at your community or at your transfer university is you'll typically have more exposure to scientific journals. There's options to take journal classes and to get used to reading journal articles and really critiquing them and looking at them closely, which I personally did not have that at my community college, but I do think it's possible. Maybe you could start a journal club with some of your friends that are studying for the MCAT, just to get exposed to those sorts of journal articles, because they're a big part of the MCAT. So you have questions like that. And then you'll also have questions like this one at the bottom where it's pretty straightforward. It doesn't have a passage with it. It's just memorization based, or that you have some sort of understanding of different biological processes. Also for biochem, they'll, just at that point, you kind of have to memorize some enzymes. It'll say which of the enzymes is involved in fatty acid oxidation. And it's just a memorization based question at that point. So for bio and biochem, I think doing content review is really helpful, but then also you do kind of want to think outside the box and start doing a little bit more like exploring scientific journals and really trying to understand what the thought process behind experimental design is. And then the last one, the last section on the exam is psychology, social and biological foundations of behavior. So this one is, again, a memorization and experimental design. There's going to be different experiments that you have to interpret and passages that are focusing on a specific social experiment or so it's tricky. Goes into to definitely understand experimental design and why, who's in the control group, who's an outlier, what's a critique of this, or what is this study looking at. But then you also have to have a lot of memorization of just terms that come up in introductions to classes. So if you've taken an introduction to psychology or an introduction to sociology class, I think that will help you a lot. Specifically, introduction to psychology will go over all of the basics for what's on the MCAT in the psych section. So I think it's, if you can take an intro to psych class over the summer at your community college, that'll help you a lot with this section, especially if you're not taking any other similar classes. Plus, it'll help you with your IGETC for transferring. So kind of a win-win there. When I took it, I had taken an introduction to psychology class. And I remember every time I was doing content review, I was like, oh, I remember that. It's pretty surface level. There are a few terms that you have to memorize. And for that, I would say that Quizlet and Anki are helpful because, you just kind of have to know what's episodic memory and little terms that will come up. And you just kind of have to know the little details between certain terms. So again, practice problems are going to be really helpful for that. And then finally, I did want to kind of go into, I think the most helpful tip I could give for people studying for the MCAT is to do full length exams. So you should try to take at least 10 full lengths. I did not end up doing this. That was my goal that I set out with, but I ended up taking about 8. I think full length exams are brutal. They're 7.5 hours, but I think they're really important just for you to try to get a feeling for where your timing's at on the exam. I always mimicked testing conditions. So again, if you're taking one section and then walking away and going and doing something, and then maybe the next day take the other section, if you break up your exam like that, it's not going to be the most helpful for you, just because the MCAT, just the exam, taking the exam itself is really grueling. And by the end of, biochem, you're exhausted. You've been studying for, you've been doing this exam for 4.5, 5 hours at that point, and you just want to be done. And then you still have another section. So I think it's good to get the mental stamina that you'll need for the actual exam by taking full lengths. I had my exam at 8 a.m. So I thought it was helpful to wake up at 7 o'clock and get my routine ready and just be fully in the testing. I love to drink coffee. I have coffee with me right now, but I didn't drink coffee as I was doing the exams because I knew that I wouldn't have that option when I was actually taking it. I even ate the same lunch. I would pack my lunch before practice exams just so I was eating the same thing. I don't know. I thought it worked for me. So just try to put myself in that headspace. And then for my very last full length, I even drove to the testing center before and made sure I'd get there at 7:30 so I could check into my exam. And then I drove back to a coffee shop and did the full length exam somewhere nearby. So it was just good to see what the traffic was going to be like in the morning and to see where it was going to be. I didn't want to get lost going to my exam. So I think all of that is just, it's good preparation. It kind of prepares you for the day. So then when it comes, you've already been through this, you know where you're going, you know what to expect. And it just takes off a little bit of anxiety. So then also save those last 4 AMC full lengths. Personally, I think because they're closest to the actual exam, I think it's the best to have them right before the exam. So you, I know some people that started with those full lengths and they took them, you know, at the beginning of when they started studying, and then they couldn't retake them and they couldn't use that information again to prepare themselves. So it's just, I think it's good to save those for the end. Also, I didn't mention this before, but the third-party exams like Kaplan or the Princeton review, your score is typically a lot lower than your actual score. My average for those exams, my real MCAT score was 13 points higher than my average for the Kaplan and Blueprint exams that I took, just because it's a business. They want you to think that you're doing bad so that you'll keep buying their products. So those scores are always a bit deflated. But then my AAMC full lengths were much closer to my realist score. They were 3 points lower, so I still did improve a little bit, but much closer. So it's also kind of a nice little boost, ego boost, to have those AAMC full lengths and be like, okay, you'll definitely see an improvement from your third-party full lengths. And then the biggest advice I'd have for full-length exams is to really review the exams thoroughly. So I have a little example down here. This is from mine. There might be typos and just confusing things in here. But basically, I would go through each question that I got wrong, and I would kind of dissect it. And why did I miss this? And what did I do wrong? I know some people who wouldn't review their exams afterwards. They would just be like, okay, and move on. But I think you really, really want to review your exams thoroughly and learn from your mistakes. It's almost like a second learning opportunity when you go through it and try to figure out, like, why did I miss this? And I think putting it into a little, I did a Google Sheets, doing one like this, it just holds you accountable. And then you can see like, oh, I keep missing questions on thermodynamics. I really need to go and review that section. And then even just, you know, ones where this is, I think for the first one on this, it was a really pretty straightforward answer. You learn pretty quickly in studying that 1 mole of gas will be 22.4 liters. And I just kind of misinterpreted the question. So you start to kind of understand the logic of the exam and what they're trying to ask. Sometimes they'll have really easy questions, but they'll be kind of hidden, and you have to be able to recognize that. So definitely review each section and each question that you missed. It's grueling, but it's really important. And I would even say, one of my friends who's a psychology major, she told me that I need to make sure to, even when I'm done with the full length, after those 7.5 hours and you're just tired and you want to be done, I would still go through once and look over everything that I missed, just so I knew. And I had already trained myself, like, okay, this is wrong. That was wrong. That was wrong. And then when I would review, then I would spend the next day doing a really deep review where I would go through each question and try to find the right formula and work out how to do it correctly. But it's just good from a psychology point of view for you don't want to reinforce those incorrect answers. So it's important to go through and find out what was wrong so that you're aware of it and you're not reinforcing that idea that it was right. So I think this is the end of my presentation, but I'm sure I wanted to open this up to the Q&A section now. So I'm going to stop sharing my screen. And then looks like we have some questions already.
I took the MCAT last year, September, and scored 492. I studied 3 months full time. My first ever diagnostic was 487. I'm restudying now full time, but my diagnostic is still at 487 to 490. I feel I know more. I know way more than before, but I don't know what I'm doing wrong because I feel like I'm not just retaining anything. My car score is the highest, so I don't think comprehension is an issue. How can I make it stick?
Yeah. So I think the fact that your CAR score is the highest, that's it doesn't seem like it's comprehension. It might be, there's a couple of different things that it could be. So I'm not sure how you're studying. That could be a big part of it. As you if you're just reading, there's like a difference between actively studying something and then passively. So just reading through the books isn't going to be super helpful. I think it's more important that you're really engaging with the material itself. So you need to be, for me, I took notes on all of the practice, all of the content review sections. I had a big Google Drive where I just took really intense notes on it. And then also practice problems are going to help you. I think taking as many practice problems from either the AMC section and question bank, and then other third party, you could do Jack Weston practice problems, practice passages. That helps. So it really is about being Uworld. Yes, thank you, Juben. You could also do Uworld practice problems, but just, doing as many of those as possible is going to help. Now, the diagnostic is also, it's a good place to get started, but I would say moving into some of the more full-length material exams and then seeing, look for a pattern. Like I was saying, if you're taking down what your questions, or sorry, if you're going over which questions you got wrong, at that point, you might be able to see a pattern about where you might be missing things and what sections you might be struggling on, and then going more in depth on there. So I would say if your studying habit doesn't feel like it's sticking, and if you're struggling with retaining, it might also be a good idea to start switching things up. So maybe looking at videos, you could watch Khan Academy videos or listen to podcasts, and then also try to explain things in your own words. So by taking notes and writing it down. But I think it's good just to kind of switch it up and try out some new things if you feel like what you're doing right now isn't sticking. And then the next question, what was the time? Oh, sorry. I can't help it. I'm used to doing the Q&As.
What was the time length between your practice and full length? Also, does it matter which section we start reviewing first, or do you recommend reviewing in order of the exam?
So as I said before, I did a month and a half of content review, and then I jumped straight into full length. So I tried to do at least one a week. Sometimes I would do two, but I would always split them up, probably with about 4 days in between. They're pretty tough. I can't imagine doing them back to back. It would just be brutal. I felt like doing at least 4 to 5 days in between gave me a chance to just spend one day focused on doing the full length, spend the day after doing content review and going through all of the questions. And then those next 2 to 3 days, I would spend doing more content review on what I had missed and reviewing it, doing practice problems related to those topics. So I think that was helpful. And then for the order of what you review, honestly, I started chapter 1 on the first book, and then I just kind of went through. I did try to, as I said, I did about 2 to 3 chapters from a day, and I would never just do, I liked kind of mixing it up. So I know some people where they start with biology and then just do biology all the way through before starting on the next book. But I personally liked to kind of do different things during the day. So I'd start with biology, 1 chapter there, do a chapter of organic chemistry, do a chapter of psych-soc in that day. So I felt like it was, for me personally, I did like breaking things up, but some people might prefer to be building the concepts build upon each other. So some people might like to stick with one topic. So I think it really kind of depends on what you like to do.
The next one is, do the years of the practice exam books matter? For example, I have the 2019 version of the Kaplan books, but I'm taking my exam in 2022.
I would say that they don't matter up until, so the MCAT itself did change in between 2000, it changed in 2015. So the format that we see now, that 4 sections, that's only been around since 2015. So I would say you definitely need a book that's that format. I don't think the old ones had quite as much on the psychology and sociology parts of the exam. So after that, I don't think it's going to make that big of a difference. especially if you're using online resources to kind of supplement things. I did hear on, Reddit, so take that at what it is, but people were saying that apparently the exam did become a little bit more experimentally based recently, but I don't know if that's true or not. But I think for content review, you'll be fine using those older books, and then you definitely want to use the updated resources from the AAMC to do your question banks and section notes. And if you're missing anything that you feel like your books didn't cover, then you can supplement with online materials like Khan Academy, or just even watching YouTube videos on it.
The next one is, well, the MCAT is content-based too. What specific test strategies do you have to tackle the test?
Yeah, the MCAT is definitely, there's test taking strategies for sure that I think make a big difference. On the exam, it's on the computer, but you're allowed to use a highlighting tool and you're allowed to use a strike through tool to like cross things off. So like I was saying earlier, for the chem physical sections, when you're seeing, knowing the units is helpful because sometimes the units aren't in that question. So I think it's helpful to cross out really look at the units for the chem phys section, like look clearly and see, okay, what units are they giving me? Because sometimes you're able to get the answer just from that. And then also if you're stuck somewhere and you like cannot figure out one of the answers, I think it's helpful, or can't figure out one of the questions, kind of looking and seeing if you can eliminate any possible answers is helpful. And then you have a 50-50 shot if you're able to get it down to 2, which is better than just randomly guessing, especially for the psychology and sociology section. A lot of times they'll give you 3 or 4 terms. They're asking you, what is this an example of? And they'll give you 4 sociology terms. If you're not sure what it is, but you know for sure it's not that one, and you can get rid of that and eliminate it. And then, I would often get stuck in between 2 questions, which isn't the worst. Then you kind of have to just guess. But when you're reviewing your exam later, you can see if that happened. I often felt trapped on the psychology and sociology questions. I would, if I wasn't sure of the answer, I would pick the one that I didn't recognize for some reason. I got so frustrated with myself inside when I had those sheets I was showing where I was doing my exam review. I would always say, stop picking the one that you don't know, because it's tempting. I don't know the answer, and here's something that I've never heard of, a term that I don't recognize. So I would feel like, well, maybe that's it, and I just don't know it. But that was just a bad idea. So it ended up usually being the one that I was like, well, maybe it could be that one. But you just kind of have to realize the things you do and what your little test taking quirks are, and identify those and then try to fight them. I'm going to be honest, I did it on my actual MCAT. I remember I ended up choosing the answer that I didn't know what it was because it just seemed tempting. So I think that's part of it. And then also for the car section, I said there's that highlighting tool. So that's another thing. Highlighting the main, I personally liked to read the questions for the car section. I would go through all of the questions before I read the passage, just so I knew what I was kind of looking out for. And then I would highlight the main idea of every section of like each paragraph. I would highlight what I thought might be that main idea, and that I think that helped. So those are some of the strategies I would recommend. And then also you want to get a feeling for timing. So I think that's where the practice taking the full length exams helps, is you get a feeling for, okay, what should I do? I know some people liked to jump through the exam a little bit because, as I said, there's passage-based questions, but then there's also standalone, probably about like 10 or 15 standalone questions where it's just quizzing you on like almost memorization. So some people would jump straight and get those done with because they really don't take as much time as the passages, and then go back and do the passages because those questions are typically at the end of the exam. So it can be kind of disheartening if you run out of time and you don't have a chance to do ones that you know you would have been able to get because you were stuck trying to do the passage-based questions. So all of these test-taking strategies are something that you'll really figure out when you're studying for, when you're taking the practice full-length exams.
The next one is, what year in college should you begin studying for the exam or consider taking it?
I think you can start studying as soon as you're taking the classes, honestly, because when it comes down to it, your introduction to chemistry and physics class, they're going to be covering a lot of the material that's on the MCAT. So by really studying for those classes and learning them and getting comfortable with the material from the beginning, that's going to help you immensely when you're actually studying for the MCAT. So when I was at community college, I remember I had an app that would give me an MCAT question a day that I usually didn't do, but sometimes I would do my MCAT question. And I don't think that really helped me because a lot of those they didn't help me learn how to read a passage and get comfortable with the passages. They were just kind of fun to do. But I definitely kept all of my class notes from my previous classes. So I ended up using those a lot during the MCATs, particularly I took pre-algebra at community college, and it had some logarithm functions in it that I ended up using quite a lot when I was studying for the MCAT, because I feel like a lot of the math it's pretty straightforward, but you do have to know logarithm rules and exponent rules. So I would say hold on to all of your notes, study when you're in the classes itself, make sure to understand that stuff might be coming up on the MCAT. You could I had the MCAT books when I was at community college, and I would when I'd learn something, I would look through, when I was done with my chemistry, I'd look through and see what the chemistry sections on the MCAT looked like, because at that point you can start looking at it. But again, I do think, this is my personal opinion, I do think it's worth it to really take the MCAT in after you've had a year at your transfer institution, just because at that point, if you're a biology or a chem major, you will have taken biochem, which is a big part of the MCAT, and having a deep understanding of different pathways is going to be super, super helpful for the MCAT. And then also just having a little bit more exposure to scientific journals. Now, my major at UCLA, we had journal clubs for every discussion. We talked about different scientific journal articles and really went through them. So that personally helped me. But also, once you're at a university, you can typically enroll in a journal club and do that if it's not a part of your major. So I would say the best time to start studying is just be taking notes all the time and focusing on it. And then, maybe doing some light studying. But after you transfer, that summer is probably the best time. You'll have to take a gap year after school, after you graduate. If you take the MCAT in the summer the summer between your junior and senior year. But I think it's worth it.
Next question is, could you please give an example of what a study week might look like? For example, hours per day, breaks, self-care, etc.
Yeah. So I'm going to go back. I'm going to share this really quickly because I think I have that little picture. It definitely varied. I should start with just saying that it was different every week. So again, here's I had that little map, this calendar where I was keeping track of all of my whatever chapter I was reading for the day. And this was during the content review part of my studying. So you can see there's days that I took off and days where I did just one or even just half of one because I was tired. Or I had my graduation ceremony in June. So I didn't study at all for the days before and that day and after. So I took 4 days off. So I took the weekends off occasionally. So I think it's important to kind of figure out what works for you. I will say that I always felt super guilty about taking time off, and I felt like I was not studying enough. And with the MCAT, I don't know if anyone can ever really study everything on the MCAT. There's so much content. So it's normal to feel like you have little gaps in your knowledge, because there is always going to be something. I've heard it described as it's a mile wide but an inch deep, where there's just so many different topics. So it can be tricky to find a good studying schedule. I will say that I typically spent the mornings studying for content review. I would spend about 4 hours on each chapter, and then I would take a break. Maybe not 4 hours, maybe 2 to 3. Take a break, do another chapter in the afternoon. I tried to be done around 4 or 5 o'clock, and then just go and do something fun and have a nice dinner and then start again. I did like to study early just because personally that works for me, is waking up, and starting studying around like 8 or 9. And then I would take days off pretty often. For self-care, I think it's important just to give yourself some time. So if you're working, that's where this starts getting a little trickier, especially if you're working full time. At that point, I do think it's in your best interest to kind of spread things out a little bit more with the content review side of things. And then, yeah, definitely don't do 2 sections, just do 1 section a day. If, maybe not every day, maybe focus more on studying for longer periods during the weekend. But then, so this was my content review, where it was probably about 8 hours a day of content review. Then when I switched over to the next part of the studying, which for me was doing practice questions and practice exams, I would do 1 practice exam during the day, be done with that around like 3 o'clock. I would quickly glance through what I had gotten wrong, just like I said. So I was trying to I wanted to reinforce that was the wrong answer. I didn't want to accidentally reinforce incorrect answers. So I wanted to know what was wrong. And then the next day I would do the review sheet, which probably took another like 8 hours. Honestly, I'd spend a lot of time on reviewing. And then it would be a little bit lighter on the days in between. I would, I'd write a checklist of what I wanted to cover, what I had missed some questions on, and I felt like I didn't understand it from the reviewing. So then I would just cover those in content review and maybe do some practice passages on Jack Weston or on the section banks. And then, yeah, so those would be a little bit lighter, probably like 4 hours on the days in between full lengths. And I took time off. I mean, I think it's so important for self-care. I didn't study the day before my MCAT. I thought, I studied a little. I went through my flashcards because I felt like I had to do something. But I think it's so important I went outside and I took a really long hike and I saw some friends and I had a nice day and went out for dinner and tried to just calm myself down and not get too stressed out about the exam. So I think it's good to keep yourself in mind and definitely give yourself some breaks and time off and, get outside, get moving, go exercise, and just try not to make the exam your life, because I felt like I did at the beginning when I was doing content review, and it honestly wasn't super helpful. It was really, really stressful. So I would say it's going to depend on your work schedule and your school schedule. But if you're able to study full time, that was what I did. Otherwise, you could do something similar, but just kind of spread it out over a longer period of time. Do we have any other?
There's one in the chat that popped up. It says, yeah, if you can read it too. It says, what were you saying about a gap year? I took a gap year before college and would like to not take one after college. What could I do to not have to take a gap year? I think is what they're asking.
Yeah. So if you don't want to take a gap year, you're going to have to you have a couple different options. So you could take the exam if you want to have a full summer to study, which I do think is helpful just because you're able to just focus on the exam. If you want to take a full summer to study, then you'll have to take your MCAT at the end of the summer before you start your junior year. So if you're a transfer student, that'll be the summer before you transfer. So take the MCAT and get it done then. And then you'll study all summer, take the MCAT at the August or September, and then you'll apply the following June. So the application, you're able to start sending out applications in June. And then I'm going to just pull it up. I feel like it's easier to explain when I have the visuals. Okay, so here's that MCAT timeline. So if you take the MCAT at this beginning, where it's that little September to December, you'll take the MCAT, you'll be done with it. And then you have the application is due in June. So you'll send that in, your primary application, and you just won't be thinking about the MCAT. So I think that's the best way to do it, is to take it the summer before your junior year. But if that doesn't work for you and you do want to get like that year of biochem that I was talking about, then you could potentially study part-time and also be taking your classes and be studying throughout your junior year. And then you'll want to take it by April or May of your junior year. And then you'll be able to submit it with your application that summer. And then basically you have to apply to med school a year before you want to get in or before you want to start at medical school. So you'll have to be like done with it, everything sent in that summer before your senior year. I have some friends right now who are they are taking a gap year, but they didn't take the MCAT when they didn't take it last summer. So they're taking it right now, and they're writing their primary applications, and they're working on their personal statement, and they're getting letters of recs, and they're working, and some of them are taking classes. It's a lot all at once. So I really do feel like it's good to get the MCAT out of the way and be done with it. So you don't have to be balancing studying for the MCAT and taking that and your application, then also potentially having to apply a little bit later because you want to see your MCAT score before you apply. And then if you have to retake the exam too, you want to give yourself time to do that successfully. So it's a little tricky. If you don't want to take a gap year, basically, long story short, you need to be done. You need to apply by the end of your junior year. So you can take the MCAT the summer before, or you could take it in the springtime of your junior year. I think that's all the questions we have so far. I'm going to stop sharing.
I have a couple, I guess. So I'm sort of MCAT. It is my life at the moment. I write June 25th. So as Madeleine knows, I've been asking her lots of stuff. But I was wondering if you had any tips on doing better on the philosophy cars passages. Like I get to those and I have absolutely no idea what they're talking about. And yeah. I did not do well on the philosophy. I think it's the first AMC full length that has like a big philosophy section on cars. It's tough because I don't think with cars, I don't feel like, studying the actual subject itself is going to help you. So like studying philosophy, I don't think is good, like necessarily the answer. It really comes back to those techniques. So maybe, have you used Jack Weston passages? Yeah, I think they're really helpful for that. Cars. You never know what I find that like the social and humanities ones, I know what they're talking about, but with the philosophy ones, I'm just sort of grasping at the few familiar words that are sprinkled throughout.
No, I definitely get it. I mean, maybe if it's consistently an issue with philosophy, maybe looking into some of the basics. I don't know, because your exam's coming up quickly, and when it comes down to it, you're likely not going to have, on the actual exam itself, I don't want to say like, you're probably not going to have a philosophy one because I might jinx it and then one will show up. But maybe looking into some of the terms might be helpful if it's consistently, you're having an issue with that.
I just uploaded MCAT content from the WMC that basically has every subject matter from like science to philosophy to sociology. So I would just look at the philosophy section and just know difference between epistemology and difference between just the big important philosophy things. And you gotta understand, like philosophy, there's only like existentialism, just know the difference of them. You don't really need to know like the detail of them. And I don't think they ask you like what is Kant's major theory, but it's more like, so I would just look at that. And I mean, I looked at the sociology and the other parts of it, and I found them to be like pretty simple stuff, but it's good to know the difference. So
and maybe using like Khan Academy.
Yeah, and you could download that. It's in the chat. It's, I'll charge Trinity $100, but everybody else could download it.
At this point, Jubin, I'm broke, so you're not getting any money out of me. I'll have another question. So I don't know if it's just that it's the first section when I'm doing it, but I find that Chem Phys, like the timing is way more of an issue than Biochem and Psych Soc, because on the last two questions I have like 20 extra minutes when I do my full lengths. Like I find like I breeze through a lot of the questions, especially the ones that are just the discrete questions and not the passage-based ones. But the physics stuff I find, well, the Chem Phys stuff I find like I'm just over analyzing maybe.
Yeah, I feel it. Chem Phys was always my worst. Even on the exam itself, that was my lowest section score. I just struggled with it. Definitely struggled with it. I do think it's definitely easy to like overthink Chem Phys and to start, I don't know. It depends on how comfortable you are with Chem and Physics in general. For me, I was a little bit nervous about them, so I think that affected it, but I ran out of time on a couple of the full lanes. Even on the real exam, I think I was up to the wire on finishing it. So it's good that you're aware that timing is the issue there and just kind of starting to get an idea. I know there's breakdowns where people say how long you should be spending on each passage. I think it's like 9 minutes or something for cards, and just to kind of like be watching the clock and being like, okay, where am I at? Flagging questions. I was flagging questions right and left. I'd flag a bunch of questions, move on. And then I would always guess though, when I flagged a question, I would try to narrow it down to like 2 and guess and then move on, but still flag it so I could review at the end, but at least I'd have something if I ran out of time. So I think it's tricky. I ended up, I did 8 full-length exams, but then I ended up doing like 12 or 13 Chem Phys sections on their own. So I just would use those blueprint exams and just do the Chem Phys part. And just to get more practice with it and more, it's nice to be able to know immediately, oh, I need this formula. And that's something that you're going to get through practice exams. And then also just having the formulas down and having the high yield topics down. So that's another thing. On the MCAT, when you're doing content review, there's going to be questions that are really high yield that are definitely going to show up on the exam that you should be familiar with. And then ones that are a little bit kind of obscure formulas that you're not really going to have to use that often. It would be pretty rare for them to come up. So doing practice exams will show you a little bit more of like what's going to be high yield. So really for Chem and Phys, you want to have like optics down and have that memorized. And that's knowing that comes up on the MCAT a lot. It's like lenses and optics. You learn about it in gen, like physics, your introductory physics, and they like to ask a lot of questions about it for some reason. So you want to have those formulas memorized, and there's others that when you're studying for, you'll see them come up. So I think it's best to try to get those down well, keep an eye on the clock, know your formulas, but then at that point too, like honestly, just kind of narrowing it down to 2 options, guessing one, flagging, and moving on, because it's happened to me before on the full lanes where I would run out of time at the end and I'd see like, oh, I could have answered, I missed 6 questions because I just didn't get to them. And like, I definitely knew the answer to 4 or 5 of them, and to lose all of those points because I was spending so much time struggling with 1 or 2 questions earlier in the exam, it's just not worth it. It's not really a good use of your time. And it sucks to have to guess and move on, but it happens. And another thing, I didn't know this when I started studying for the MCAT, is that there's actually, for each MCAT, there's something called experimental questions peppered in. So I don't know the exact number of how many there are, but there are questions on the exam that aren't going to count for your score. So I remember for my biochem, there were questions that were so hard I could not understand. I had no idea what they were asking me. It felt impossible. I felt really bad about my biochem score, and it ended up being 131. Like, it was really, really good. And that was because I think a lot of them were experimental questions. So when you're on the MCAT itself, like when you're taking it, it's going to feel a little bit, for me, it felt a little bit harder than the practice exams, but then my score ended up being the highest because there's those questions that don't really count. They're in there for them to, there's some stats thing going on where they're taking these difficult questions and then using them to like write next year's exams and to see which questions, you know, enough people are able to pass. But I'm, you know, if like only 2% of people get it, then they throw it out. So I don't know. I think that's something to keep in mind too with the actual MCAT is, yeah. I hope that answered that.
There's another question in the Q&A that says, did you have a goal score you wanted to reach or just wanted to get over a certain percentile? If so, did you adjust your study methods to reach that goal that you set?
Yeah, my initial goal was, my goal was to get, I really want to stay in the LA area for medical school. So the medical schools in the Los Angeles areas tend to have average MCATs above 515. So I wanted to get above a 515 so that I'd be a competitive applicant for those schools. So going into it, that was my my goal. On the Kaplan exams, I ended up, my average, I think, was about a 507. So I wanted, you know, I wanted to get up to 515, and I was starting to get pretty disheartened when I was doing the those exams. I just kept, you know, I wasn't able to break 510. So I did start studying more, and then I did realize though that they were deflated. So that I wasn't aware that the scores were deflated going into it by about like 10 points. I've read online. So it went up a lot when I did the AMC exams, and I was in my target range, and then I just kept studying as I was going. But my first diagnostic was, it was through Kaplan. I think it was like a 500. Probably. So at that was before I was really studying though. So then that was just kind of to see where I was at. And I realized pretty quickly on that Chem Physics was going to be a struggle for me. And I really needed to devote the most time to that section. So all of that being said, I found something that worked for me pretty well. I do think that I noticed the most increase in my scores, my full length practice, when I started doing practice questions. So going into it, you know, I think on my very first Kaplan full length, I got like a 5.0, I think like a 5.05 or 5.06. So it was still lower than I wanted. So in between that, I started doing all the practice exams and practice questions. And that was after I was done with content review. So I was kind of frustrated. I think a lot of the MCAT is just getting familiar with how the questions are asked, and you kind of have to understand the logic of the exam a little bit. So by exposing yourself to as many practice questions as possible, you start to see what their logic is. You know, sometimes you'll have a complicated mathematical equation, but if you look at all of the answers, they've already done all the math. It's 200 for everything. It's just the units are different. So then you have to go, you know, at that point, you know that you're just looking to understand the units. It's little things like that that are difficult to explain until you're really in the thick of studying for it. But you just kind of have to start looking at, you take the practice questions and then you see the logic behind it, and that helps your score improve a lot.
I don't see any more questions. I will say one thing I've learned through taking practice questions is they bombard you with information in those passages that you don't necessarily need to answer the questions. And I've just a tip for everyone out there: if you don't recognize all the gene mutations they're giving you in the passage, it's not going to matter, because they're not expecting you to know specifics, they're expecting you to know concepts. So I remember when I was doing my first few passages and I was like, I don't know any of this information. I was like, oh, I don't, and I was reading the passage and not looking at the question and like stressing out. And then I was reading the question and I was like, oh, so don't worry about that too much.
Yeah, definitely. A lot of it, definitely. They'll bombard you with information, especially in biochem. It's those passages, and even in anytime there's an experimental passage, I feel like they give you so much information. It can be tricky. So that kind of ties back to the test taking strategies. For a lot of people, it probably is helpful. You want to get your timing down, but it might be helpful to look over the questions briefly before you start reading the passage. Just, I think for cars in particular, and that's another thing, cars will bombard you with, it's a lot. If you're really reading super closely each paragraph and like trying to understand it before you even get to the questions, I don't think that's going to be a good use of your time, because it's a little bit more specific. I think that's all I have for now. I'm gonna post a few links in the chat really quickly. I know Jubin was doing some, but I want to pull up. And then another thing, just a little plug, we actually do have, we had Dr. Is he a doctor now? Ken Tao, I think he was on.
Yes.
Okay, we had Dr. Ken Tao right before he received his doctorate, but he works over at Med School Coach. He's the director of the MCAT for them. And we had him back in October do 3 hours of MCAT prep. So he goes really, really deep into studying for the MCAT. So I'm just going to post a link to that from our YouTube channel real quick. And then also I'm going to post a link to Jack Weston, because that's a free resource that if you're interested in studying for the MCAT, I think it's a good idea to maybe look over those, and you can start seeing what the passages kind of look like. Oh, thanks, Jubin. Okay, and there's Jack Weston. Yeah, and then I'm going to put my my email in here. If anyone didn't have a chance to ask a question or something comes up later, you can email me there at my PreMedCC email. Okay, well, if there's no more questions.
All right. Thank you, Madeleine.
Of course.
Sorry for the little technical issue we've had. We're also going to post your presentation on your event page, and the video will be posted as soon as it's rendered.
Perfect. Thank you so much. And thank you everyone for coming. I hope I was able to help answer some of the questions that people may have had.